When Jasmine Kensington set off alone into the Appalachian wilderness in September 2017, her brother expected her back within only a few days. But she never emerged from those ancient mountains. For 6 years, search teams found nothing, not even a trace of her planned route through the forest. Before we start, tell us where you're listening from. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's dive into this story. Then, in 2023, a group of explorers detected an inexplicable electromagnetic signal pulsing from deep within a hidden small cave opening. A shocking discovery that would unravel a mystery more bewildering than anyone imagined. The Appalachian Mountains don't just keep secrets, they create silence. And by Tuesday, September 19, 2017, the silence where Jasmine Kensington's voice should have been was becoming deafening. For her brother, Andrew, the day unfolded in a series of small, anxious rituals. He'd check his phone, stare at the blank screen where a text message should have appeared, and then force himself to put it down. Jasmine was supposed to have emerged from the trail the previous afternoon, Monday at the latest. She would have driven to the nearest town with cell service, sent a triumphant, "I'm alive and filthy" text, and then called him, her voice buzzing with the energy she always drew from the wild. But Monday had passed with nothing. Now Tuesday was bleeding into evening, and the quiet from his phone felt heavy, unnatural. Andrew reasoned with himself. Jasmine was 32, a seasoned hiker, and fiercely independent. A sprained ankle, a flooded trail forcing a long detour, a simple miscalculation of time, any of these were plausible. She was capable. She knew how to handle herself. He repeated this mantra, but with each passing hour, the words felt hollower. This trip was different. She had gone alone. It wasn't supposed to be a solo expedition. For weeks, the plan had been for Jasmine to go with Nathan Coleridge, a close friend from her architectural firm. They had bonded over a shared frustration with urban life and a love for rugged landscapes. They'd spread maps across their desks during lunch breaks, tracing routes with their fingers, planning a 5-day trek that would push their limits. But the day before they were set to leave, Nathan had called Jasmine, his voice a miserable croak. A sudden, violent stomach bug had left him incapacitated. He was deeply apologetic, but there was no way he could go. Andrew had urged her to postpone. But Jasmine was resolute. She had already taken the time off work, a rare block of uninterrupted freedom she desperately needed. The mountains were calling to her, an obsession that had taken firm root just 2 weeks earlier when she and Andrew had taken a short-day hike in a more accessible part of the range. She had been captivated by the ancient rolling peaks and the sheer, overwhelming greenness of it all. She had to go back. Going alone didn't frighten her. The thought of staying home, trapped in her apartment, was far worse. So she'd packed her gear, reassured her brother she would stick to the planned route, and left. By Wednesday morning, the rationalizations had evaporated, replaced by a cold, hard knot of fear in Andrew's stomach. He made the call. He spoke to a calm, professional dispatcher at the county sheriff's office, his own voice tight as he explained the situation. He gave them her name, Jasmine Kensington, her age, 32, and her description. He detailed her car, a sedan, and the specific trailhead where she had intended to start her hike, a remote access point known for its difficult terrain. The dispatcher assured him a park ranger would be sent to check the parking area. A few hours later, the call came back. A ranger had driven up the winding gravel road to the trailhead. The parking lot was empty, save for one vehicle, a sedan covered in a fine layer of dust and pollen, parked neatly under the shade of a large oak tree. The discovery was a double-edged sword. It confirmed she had arrived safely and entered the wilderness as planned, but it also meant that for 5 full days, she had been somewhere inside that vast, unforgiving, expansive forest, and she had not come out. The official missing person report was filed. The search was about to begin. Andrew emailed the police the most recent photo he had of his sister. It was from that hike they had taken together just 2 weeks before. In the image, Jasmine is perched on a mossy, gnarled tree branch, her face lit with a wide, genuine smile. She's wearing a bright blue jacket, a vibrant orange cap pushed back on her brown hair, and a large hiking pack strapped to her back. It was a picture of pure happiness and confidence, a perfect encapsulation of the woman who was now lost. That image, meant to be a cherished memory of a joyful day, was now a crucial tool in a desperate race against time, the face of a mystery that was just beginning to unfold. The initial response was a model of efficiency, a surge of human order against the chaos of the wild. A command post bloomed at the edge of the gravel parking lot where Jasmine's sedan sat, a silent, lonely sentinel. White tents, folding tables covered in topographical maps, and the crackle of multiple radio frequencies filled the air. State police cruisers and park ranger trucks lined the road, their flashing lights muted by the dense morning fog clinging to the valleys. This was the front line of the search for Jasmine Kensington, a small island of determined activity on the shore of an immense, indifferent ocean of green. The first teams went in at dawn. They were composed of seasoned park rangers and local sheriff's deputies, men and women who understood this terrain. They moved with a practiced economy, their eyes scanning not just the trail but the periphery, the thicket of rhododendron, the steep leaf-slicked banks of the creeks, the dark hollows between ancient trees. Their strategy was methodical, based on the route Jasmine had outlined to her brother. They started at the trailhead and worked their way outward, following the primary path, while smaller teams branched off to check parallel ridges and drainage ditches, places where a hiker might slip and fall out of sight. By the second day, the operation had swelled. Volunteer Search and Rescue (SAR) teams from 3 counties arrived, bringing with them their own expertise and equipment. K-9 units were deployed, their handlers giving the dogs a scent article, a T-shirt from Jasmine's apartment, before letting them work the trail. The dogs strained at their leads, noses to the ground, but the scent trail seemed to dissipate within a few hundred yards of the parking lot, a common problem in the damp, complex environment of the forest floor. From above, a state police helicopter chopped through the air. Its crew used binoculars and thermal cameras to scan the vast, unbroken canopy. But the forest in late summer is a dense ceiling of leaves, and from the air, it revealed nothing. The helicopter might as well have been searching for a single lost leaf among millions. Andrew Kensington was a constant, quiet presence at the command post. He'd brought a box of donuts and coffee he couldn't drink, a small, helpless gesture of gratitude. He studied the maps alongside the search coordinator, a grizzled, sun-beaten ranger named Frank Miller. Frank would point to sections of the map, explaining the day's search grids in a calm, steady voice. But Andrew could see the scale of the challenge. The lines on the map were clean and precise. The reality they represented was a tangled vertical world of rock, root, and shadow. Every hour that passed felt like a physical weight pressing down on him. For a week, the search yielded nothing. Not a footprint, not a discarded granola bar wrapper, not a single sign that Jasmine had passed that way. It was baffling. Even in an accident, a hiker as experienced as Jasmine would have left some trace. The searchers themselves were leaving more signs of their passage than they were finding of her. The mood at the command post grew more somber. The initial buzz of urgent activity settled into a grim, grinding routine. Then, on the 8th day, a flicker of hope. A radio call crackled through the command post, sharp and clear. A volunteer team searching a difficult, swampy area several miles east of Jasmine's planned route had found something. The team leader's voice was strained with excitement. They'd found a small piece of fabric, a vibrant turquoise blue, snagged on a thorny branch overhanging a deep, muddy creek bed. The color was a near-perfect match for the jacket in the photo of Jasmine. The news sent a jolt of adrenaline through the entire operation. Frank Miller immediately began redirecting resources. 2 expert tracking teams were dispatched to the location along with a forensics deputy. The helicopter was diverted to circle the new area. At the command post, Andrew felt a surge of desperate optimism, a feeling so sharp it was painful. This was it. They had found her trail. The location was troubling. It was rugged, off-road, and suggested she might have been in serious trouble, perhaps disoriented or fleeing something. But it was a lead. It was something tangible in a search that had so far been defined by absence. The teams converged on the new quadrant. The terrain was a nightmare. The ground was a sucking mire, and the undergrowth was a thorny, nearly impenetrable wall of vegetation. Progress was agonizingly slow. For 2 full days, they scoured the area, moving outward in concentric circles from the branch where the fabric was found. They battled insects, heat, and the constant threat of twisted ankles and falls. The hope that had ignited the search began to flicker under the strain. The definitive answer came late on the second day. The fabric scrap was brought back to the command post in an evidence bag. Frank Miller and a senior investigator examined it under a magnifying lamp. It was the right color, but the material felt wrong. It was a cheaper, heavier nylon than the high-tech, lightweight material of Jasmine's jacket. Miller, who had worked in these mountains for 30 years, recognized it. It was from an older model of fishing vest, a popular brand sold at a major retail chain a decade ago. It was a common piece of litter, a ghost of some long-forgotten fishing trip, completely unrelated to Jasmine Kensington. The news landed with the force of a physical blow. The 2 days spent in that treacherous swamp had been a waste of time, resources, and most importantly, hope. The morale of the search teams, already worn thin, plummeted. The brief flicker of a lead had been extinguished, leaving the darkness deeper than before. The weather turned. A low-pressure system moved in from the west, bringing with it a cold, persistent rain that soaked the mountains for 3 straight days. The trails turned to mud. The creeks swelled into dangerous torrents, and a thick fog settled over the peaks, grounding the helicopter indefinitely. The search was becoming not just difficult, but dangerous for the searchers themselves. On the 14th day, Frank Miller sat down with Andrew at one of the folding tables. He laid out the facts gently but firmly. They had covered over 100 square miles of some of the most difficult terrain in the state. They had investigated the only lead, which had proven false. They had found absolutely no sign of his sister. With the weather conditions deteriorating and no new information to guide them, the official large-scale search operation was being suspended. It wasn't an end, he explained. The case would remain open. Rangers would continue to be on alert, but the massive coordinated effort was over. The volunteers packed their gear, their faces etched with exhaustion and disappointment. The tents came down. The trucks and cruisers drove away, leaving Jasmine's sedan alone once more in the gravel lot. Sporadic, smaller searches organized by friends and determined strangers continued for a few more weekends. But as September gave way to October, their numbers dwindled. The leaves began to turn, carpeting the forest floor in a new layer of red and gold, burying any secrets that might have been left behind. The Appalachian wilderness fell silent again, having swallowed Jasmine Kensington whole, leaving behind nothing but a photograph and a string of unanswered questions. 2 years passed. For Andrew Kensington, time had reshaped his grief from a sharp, frantic panic into a dull, chronic ache. The world had, by necessity, moved on. Jasmine's apartment was eventually emptied, her belongings sorted and stored in boxes that sat in Andrew's garage, silent monuments to a life interrupted. Her job at the architectural firm had posted her position, and it had been filled. The relentless forward march of life had smoothed over the hole she'd left, at least on the surface. But for Andrew, and for the handful of investigators who kept her file on a corner of their desks, the silence she left behind had never truly gone away. It was a low hum of unresolved questions, a constant background noise to their lives. The official status of the case was inactive, pending new information. It was a bureaucratic term for a dead end. Then, in the late summer of 2019, an echo of that silence reverberated through the Appalachian region, this time with a terrifying new sound. News reports began to circulate about another missing hiker, a young woman who had been trekking solo in a national forest over 100 miles south of where Jasmine had vanished. But this time, the woman wasn't just missing. After a week-long search, her body was found. She had been assaulted and left in a shallow grave, crudely concealed just off a popular trail. The crime was brutal, personal, and it sent a shockwave of fear through the tight-knit hiking community. The media coverage was intense, and the details were grim. The perpetrator had left behind a scene of violence, but no clear forensic trail. No suspect was ever identified. For most of the public, it was a tragic but isolated incident. But in a quiet, climate-controlled office in the state capitol, a detective named Wallace, part of a regional cold case unit, felt a prickle of professional unease. His job was to look for patterns to connect the dots that others had missed. The murder of the solo hiker was outside his direct jurisdiction, but part of his protocol was to cross-reference the details of any major violent crime against his unit's roster of unsolved cases. He pulled up Jasmine Kensington's file. On the surface, the two cases were starkly different. Jasmine's disappearance was a complete void, an utter lack of evidence. The other case was the opposite, a scene of horrific, tangible violence. But Wallace couldn't shake the core similarities. A lone female hiker, experienced and confident, targeted in the seeming safety of the wilderness. The predator in the new case had been bold. Was it possible he had struck before? Perhaps with a different method. Could Jasmine's disappearance have been a first attempt? One where the killer had been more successful at concealing his crime, leaving no body and no scene to analyze? The theory was a long shot, a tenuous thread stretched over 100 miles and 2 years. But it was the first new threat of any kind in the Kensington case since the search was called off. The file was officially reactivated. Detective Wallace and his partner drove out to meet with Andrew Kensington first. They sat in his living room, the old photo of a smiling Jasmine on the mantelpiece seeming to watch them. They explained the new context, the grim possibility that they were no longer looking for a hiker who had succumbed to the elements, but a woman who may have encountered a predator. Andrew listened in stoic silence, his face pale. The idea was a fresh hell, replacing the ambiguous agony of not knowing with a specific, horrifying scenario. Their next stop was to see Nathan Coleridge. They met him at a coffee shop, a neutral ground. 2 years had changed him. The easygoing confidence he'd shared with Jasmine was gone, replaced by a more reserved, haunted demeanor. He'd since left the architectural firm, explaining that the daily reminders were too much. When the detectives laid out the new theory, Nathan's reaction was visceral. He stared into his coffee cup, his hands trembling slightly. The thought that Jasmine might have been murdered, and that he was supposed to have been there with her, seemed to land on him with a physical weight. Wallace observed him carefully. He asked Nathan to walk them through the timeline again, specifically the 48 hours before Jasmine left. Nathan recounted the dinner they'd had, their excitement for the trip. He then described the illness that had struck him in the middle of the night, a violent, debilitating bout of what he assumed was food poisoning. He'd been sick for the entire next day, barely able to leave his bathroom. He told them he had gone to an urgent care clinic that morning, desperate for some relief. It was a detail he had mentioned in 2017, but it had been of little consequence then. Now it was critical. "Do you remember which clinic?" Wallace asked, his tone casual. Nathan named it without hesitation. "Would you be willing to sign a release for us to obtain those records?" "Of course," Nathan said, looking up, his eyes meeting the detective's. "Anything that helps. Do you really think that's what happened to her?" The detectives left him with non-committal assurances. The next day, they had the records from the urgent care clinic. They were time-stamped and detailed. Nathan Coleridge had checked in at 10:15 a.m. on the day Jasmine left for her trip. The attending physician's notes described symptoms of acute gastroenteritis, food poisoning, and documented that he was given intravenous fluids for dehydration. He had paid his co-pay with a credit card. His alibi was ironclad. The lead, like the scrap of blue fabric 2 years prior, dissolved into nothing. Nathan Coleridge was not a suspect, but the exercise had not been a waste. The investigation into Jasmine Kensington's disappearance had fundamentally and irrevocably shifted. The primary theory was no longer a tragic accident. In the minds of the cold case unit, they were now hunting for a ghost who may have been the victim of a monster. The vast, silent wilderness no longer seemed empty. It seemed to be hiding something far more sinister than a simple tragic fall. The case file on Jasmine Kensington went quiet again, but the nature of that quiet had changed. It now sat in the suspected foul play category, a subtle but significant shift in its classification. For another 4 years, it gathered digital dust. The world turned, technology evolved, and the memory of the missing hiker from 2017 faded further into the background, a ghost story whispered among Appalachian Trail veterans. Then, on a crisp Saturday in October of 2023, 6 years after Jasmine vanished, a group of 3 men were pushing their way through a section of the Appalachian Mountains rarely touched by human feet. They weren't hikers in the traditional sense. They were members of a small niche community who called themselves the Appalachian Geological Survey Group. It was a rather formal name for what was essentially a hobby born of a shared fascination with the Earth's unseen forces. Armed with an array of sensitive scientific instruments, they sought out geological and magnetic anomalies, hoping to map undiscovered mineral veins, undocumented cave systems, or simply to satisfy their own curiosity about the planet's hidden architecture. The leader of the trio, a 40-year-old former IT technician named Marcus, was at the forefront, his eyes on the screen of a black handheld device. It was a Latynx AF5000, a sophisticated EMF meter capable of detecting a wide spectrum of electromagnetic fields. For most of the day, the device had been predictably placid, showing only the faint background hum of the Earth's natural magnetic field. But as they traversed a steep, densely wooded slope covered in a thick carpet of autumn leaves, the device suddenly chirped to life. Marcus stopped, holding up a hand to his companions, Ben and Leo. He glanced at the screen. The digital numbers were climbing rapidly. 20, 45, 60. A red bar graph on the display lit up, indicating a strong magnetic field. He took a step to his left, and the numbers dropped. He stepped back to his right, and they shot up again, peaking at a steady, inexplicable 87 megos. "What is it?" Ben asked, coming up behind him. "I have no idea," Marcus muttered, his brow furrowed. "We're miles from any power lines. There's no infrastructure out here at all. But I've got a strong, very localized magnetic field. It's like there's a giant magnet buried right here." The signal was incredibly precise. It was powerful in a 5-foot radius and virtually non-existent beyond it. This wasn't a natural geological anomaly, which would typically be much broader. This was something else. Driven by a puzzle, the 3 men began clearing the thick layer of dead leaves and forest debris from the ground at the heart of the signal. They used their hands and the toes of their boots, scraping away years of accumulated decay. Beneath the leaves, they found it. It wasn't a cave entrance in the classic sense, not a gaping mouth on a cliffside. It was a fissure, a dark vertical crack in the earth, partially obscured by a tangle of roots from an ancient overturned tree. The opening was narrow, perhaps only 3 feet wide, a jagged wound in the mountainside that seemed to exhale a cool, damp air. Marcus held the EMF meter over the opening. The reading of 87 held steady, the signal emanating directly from the darkness. The mystery was now irresistible. This was exactly the kind of discovery their group lived for. After a brief discussion, they decided Marcus, the most experienced climber among them, would investigate. They unpacked their gear, and Marcus clipped into a safety harness and rope, which Ben and Leo anchored securely to a sturdy living tree. With a headlamp strapped to his forehead, he clicked it on, its bright white beam cutting into the profound blackness of the fissure. He carefully lowered himself into the opening. The initial descent was tight, the rock cold and damp against his jacket. After about 10 feet, the fissure suddenly widened dramatically. He was no longer in a crack, but at the top of a vast, silent chamber. He was hanging in open space. He played his headlamp beam across the cavern, revealing glistening wet rock walls that stretched far beyond the light's reach. The air was still and ancient. He looked down. The beam of his light didn't find a floor. It just disappeared into a seemingly bottomless darkness. He was at the top of a massive vertical pit. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down his spine. He called up to his friends that the fissure opened into a huge cave with a sheer drop. As his eyes slowly adjusted to the gloom, he scanned the perimeter of the pit below. And then his headlamp beam caught something far below. At what he estimated to be a drop of at least 60, maybe 70 feet, was a small splash of color against the dark rock. He squinted, focusing the beam. It looked like a pile of fabric, a sleeping bag, perhaps, and some other material next to it. His first thought was of some old mining camp, a relic left behind decades ago. It was a fascinating find, but it didn't explain the EMF signal. He climbed back up, his mind racing. "There's gear down there," he told Ben and Leo as he pulled himself out of the fissure. "A sleeping bag, maybe a pack, but it's at the bottom of a huge pit. There's no way the signal from my meter could be coming from that far down. It has to be up here." The puzzle of the signal remained. If the source wasn't the gear below, it had to be somewhere near the entrance. Leaving the ropes in place, Marcus began a more meticulous search of the fissure's opening. He ran the EMF meter along every crack and crevice in the rock face. The signal fluctuated wildly until he held the device near a small dry alcove in the rock wall just inside the entrance and about chest high. The meter screamed. The number 87 locked on the screen. He reached into the alcove. His fingers brushed against something cold, plastic, and rectangular wedged tightly between two rocks. He worked it free and pulled it out into the daylight. It was a small personal two-way radio, a walkie-talkie. It was weathered and dirty, but intact. The three men stood in silence, looking from the radio to the dark fissure, then back at the radio. This was no longer a geological curiosity. A radio intentionally placed to broadcast a signal paired with abandoned camping gear at the bottom of a deadly pit. This was something else entirely. This was a scene. With a shared grim understanding, Marcus pulled out his satellite phone, a device they carried for emergencies exactly like this, and dialed 911. The arrival of law enforcement transformed the quiet, remote mountainside into a hub of controlled, urgent activity. The initial responding deputies secured the scene, their expressions grim as they peered into the dark fissure, listening to Marcus' methodical account of the discovery. They immediately recognized the potential significance. A missing person case in this area, even 1 year old, leaves a long shadow. Within hours, the information had been relayed up the chain of command, and a detective from the Regional Cold Case Unit, Detective Wallace, was en route. When Wallace arrived, the scene was already being prepped for a complex operation. He recognized the name Kensington the moment the dispatcher relayed the potential link. The discovery of the gear, described as a sleeping bag and backpack, was a strong match for the inventory list Andrew Kensington had provided 6 years ago. Wallace stood at the edge of the fissure, the same cool, damp air that Marcus had felt breathing from the earth. He looked at the small black radio, now sealed in an evidence bag. It was an unassuming object, yet it hummed with implications that made the hair on his arms stand up. A specialized cave rescue team, CRT, a unit of firefighters and paramedics with advanced training in vertical rope rescue, was called in. Their arrival brought a new level of technical precision to the scene. They established a complex system of anchors and pulleys, their brightly colored ropes a stark contrast to the muted tones of the forest. The plan was twofold. First, to safely rappel into the pit to document and retrieve the gear. Second, to conduct an initial search of the immediate cavern for any other signs of human presence. 2 members of the CRT, harnessed and helmeted, descended into the darkness, their headlamps cutting through the gloom, their voices echoing slightly as they communicated over their helmet radios with the surface team. From the bottom of the 60-foot drop, their voices crackled back to the surface. "We have a visual on the items. 1 sleeping bag, blue. 1 large frame backpack, beige. Both appear to have significant weathering." They carefully documented the position of the items before touching anything. The backpack was partially open. Its contents spilled slightly. The sleeping bag was unrolled as if someone had been using it. But as they swept the area with their powerful lights, they confirmed the most critical fact: there was no body. There were no human remains, not even bone fragments, visible in the immediate vicinity of the gear. The items were carefully packaged in large evidence bags and painstakingly hauled to the surface. As they emerged into the daylight, Detective Wallace and Andrew Kensington, who had been notified and had driven for hours to be there, looked on. Andrew's face was a mask of strained composure as he identified the backpack. It was Jasmine's. He recognized a distinctive patch she had sewn onto one of the straps. The 6-year-old mystery had finally yielded a tangible clue, but it only deepened the central question: where was she? While the gear was being processed, the radio was sent directly to the State Police Forensics Lab. It was handed over to a technician named Sarah, a specialist in electronics and data recovery. Her initial assessment was that the device was in poor condition, its casing scratched, and its battery compartment showing signs of corrosion. She didn't expect to find much, but when she connected it to a diagnostic tool, she got a faint power reading. The battery wasn't completely dead. This was the first major anomaly. A standard alkaline battery left in a device for 6 years would have been inert. Sarah carefully disassembled the radio. The findings she made next would shatter every existing theory about the case. Based on the specific model of the lithium batteries inside and their measured level of degradation and remaining voltage, she could create a rough timeline. These batteries had not been sitting in this device since 2017. Her conservative estimate was that the radio had been actively powered on, broadcasting its intermittent beacon for no more than 18 months. It had likely been placed in that rocky crevice sometime in the spring or summer of 2022. When Detective Wallace received Sarah's report, he had to read it twice. The implications were staggering. This wasn't the scene of a 6-year-old accident. Jasmine Kensington, or someone with her radio, had been alive as recently as a year and a half ago. She hadn't just fallen into this pit and perished. The narrative of a tragic hiking accident was obliterated. The new timeline raised 1,000 new questions. How could she have survived? And if she was alive in 2022, where was she now? The focus of the investigation pivoted with whiplash intensity. This was no longer a cold case recovery. It was an active search for a person who might still be alive. The cave system became the new ground zero. A professional speleological team, cave mapping experts, was contracted to create a full survey of the underground network. Their work revealed the true scale of what lay beneath the fissure. It was not a single chamber, but a sprawling labyrinth of interconnected tunnels and passages stretching for miles in multiple directions. For 2 weeks, the mappers worked using laser measurement tools and deploying small drones in the larger chambers. Deep within the system, nearly half a mile from the initial pit where Jasmine's gear was found, they made their second monumental discovery. Concealed in a secluded, densely vegetated hollow on the surface, they found another entrance to the cave. This one was no mere fissure. It was a wide-arching opening large enough to walk through upright. A gentle sloping floor of packed earth led down into the main cavern network. It was a clear, relatively easy way in and out of the cave system, a natural doorway that showed signs of occasional animal use. The discovery was a paradox. The entire case was now balanced on a series of contradictions. Jasmine's gear was at the bottom of a death trap, yet there was an easy exit nearby. A radio was placed as a beacon at the dangerous entrance, not the safe one. She was alive for years after she vanished, yet she never made contact. The cave had given up some of its secrets, but in doing so, it had created an even more profound and disturbing mystery. The question was no longer just what happened to Jasmine Kensington in 2017, but what had she become in the years that followed? The revelation that Jasmine Kensington might have been alive as recently as 2022 sent shock waves through the investigation, forcing Detective Wallace and his team to dismantle every theory they had ever constructed. The image of a lone hiker lost to the elements was gone, replaced by the far more complex and haunting specter of a long-term survivor, or perhaps a long-term captive. If Jasmine had been alive for 5 years, her disappearance was not a random act of nature. It was an event with a human cause and potentially a human perpetrator. With this new terrifying lens, the investigation turned inward, back toward the people who had populated Jasmine's life. The circle was small. Jasmine was a private person with a few close friends and a devoted brother. In the harsh calculus of homicide investigation, suspicion often falls first on those closest to the victim. Andrew Kensington was quickly ruled out. His grief had been raw, public, and unwavering for 6 years, and his actions had always been solely focused on finding his sister. That left one name from the original file still lingering with a faint, unanswered question mark: Nathan Coleridge. The suspicion was reluctant, almost distasteful to the investigators. Nathan had been cleared in 2019, his alibi seemingly solid. But the circumstances had changed so dramatically that every piece of the puzzle had to be re-examined. The new timeline, Jasmine alive until 2022, opened up possibilities that hadn't existed before. The theory was dark and convoluted. Could Nathan have been involved not in her initial disappearance, but in her continued captivity? Could his alibi for the day she went missing have been a clever misdirection, masking a more sinister, long-term plan? It felt like a stretch, like something from a movie script. But Wallace's job was to follow every possibility to its logical, and sometimes illogical, conclusion. He assigned a junior detective to conduct a deep-dive financial background check on Nathan Coleridge, looking for anything out of the ordinary, any unexplained income, any unusual behavior in the years since Jasmine vanished. 4 weeks, the detective sifted through digital records, bank statements, and credit reports. Most of Nathan's life was unremarkable. He had changed jobs, moved apartments once, and lived a quiet, solitary life. But then the detective found it. In the months leading up to Jasmine's disappearance in 2017, Nathan Coleridge had been in serious financial trouble. Credit card statements showed dozens of cash advances taken at casino ATMs. Bank records revealed a series of large, unexplained withdrawals and a pattern of deposits that didn't match his salary. He was being pursued by at least 2 collection agencies. Nathan Coleridge had been struggling with a significant gambling debt. Suddenly, a potential motive, however grim, materialized. It wasn't clean or simple, but it was there. Investigators began to spin out a scenario. What if Nathan, desperate for money, had concocted a plan involving Jasmine? Perhaps there was a life insurance policy they didn't know about, or some other anticipated financial gain. What if the food poisoning story was a lie, a carefully constructed alibi to remove himself from the immediate timeline of her disappearance while he orchestrated it from afar? The theory had holes. It was elaborate and required a level of psychopathic cunning that didn't seem to fit the man they'd interviewed. But the debt was a concrete fact, a powerful motivator for desperate acts. Wallace knew he had to confront him. The second interview with Nathan Coleridge was starkly different from the first. It didn't take place in a coffee shop. This time, it was in a small, gray, featureless room at the county sheriff's department. 2 detectives, Wallace and a younger, more imposing partner, sat across a metal table from him. Nathan looked bewildered, his initial cooperation curdling into confusion and fear as the tone of the questioning shifted. Wallace laid out the new evidence. The radio, the new timeline, the fact that Jasmine had been alive for years. Nathan's shock seemed genuine, but then Wallace slid a folder across the table. It contained copies of Nathan's bank statements from 2017. "We know you were in a lot of trouble back then, Nathan," Wallace said, his voice even. "Gambling debts, collectors calling. You were desperate." Nathan stared at the papers, his face flushing. That has nothing to do with this," he stammered. "That was a long time ago. I had a problem. I dealt with it." "How did you deal with it?" the second detective pressed. "Did Jasmine know about your debts? Was she trying to help you? Did you have an argument?" The questions came faster, harder. They pressed him on every detail of his alibi. Could he have faked the food poisoning? Was there anyone who could verify he was at home sick for the entire day? The implication hung heavy and suffocating in the small room, that he had not only been involved in her disappearance, but had somehow kept her hidden for 5 years. Nathan was visibly crumbling under the pressure, but his story never wavered. He insisted on his innocence, his voice cracking with a mixture of indignation and despair. He admitted to the gambling problem, calling it the worst mistake of his life, but swore it had nothing to do with Jasmine. He repeated the details of his visit to the urgent care clinic. The detectives had already pulled the complete file. They knew the answer before they asked the question. They had not only the check-in records and the credit card receipt, but they had also re-interviewed the attending physician from the clinic. The doctor, now retired, had a clear memory of the case only because of his detailed notes. He remembered a patient genuinely suffering from severe dehydration, a condition difficult to fake to a trained medical professional. Furthermore, the deep-dive financial investigation had also uncovered how Nathan had resolved his debts. In late 2018, nearly a year after Jasmine vanished, he had received a modest inheritance of about $50,000 from a great-aunt who had passed away. The probate court records were public and unambiguous. The inheritance was legitimate, expected, and completely unrelated to Jasmine Kensington. It was just enough to clear his debts and get his life back on track. After 4 hours of intense questioning, the detectives knew they had reached the end of the line. Nathan Coleridge was not their man. His story was consistent, and the evidence that had initially cast suspicion on him ultimately exonerated him. He was a man with a past problem, but he was not a monster. As Nathan left the station, looking shaken and diminished, Detective Wallace felt a familiar wave of frustration. They had pursued their strongest, most logical lead to its definitive conclusion, and it had led them nowhere. The sinister theory of a meticulously planned long-term abduction dissolved, leaving them back where they started. They had a cave, a radio, and a ghost who had apparently survived for 5 years, only to vanish again. The human element had failed them. The only thing left to interrogate was the cave itself. With all human leads exhausted and Nathan Coleridge definitively cleared, the investigation turned back to the cold, silent witness at the heart of the mystery, the cave. The initial search by the cave rescue team had been focused on finding Jasmine or her remains. Now, Detective Wallace ordered a second, far more meticulous forensic sweep. This time, the goal was not just to find a person, but to find the story of a life. He wanted to know how someone could have survived in the subterranean world. A team of forensic specialists accustomed to combing through houses and crime scenes was paired with the speleological experts. 4 days, they worked under the stark, sterile glare of portable floodlights, transforming the main cavern into an underground laboratory. They moved with painstaking slowness, gritting off sections of the cave floor, sifting through dust and soil that had lain undisturbed for centuries. The first significant discovery came from the area near the easy walkout entrance, the wide arched opening that led back to the world. Tucked into a dry alcove, partially shielded from the main cavern's drafts, they found a small, makeshift fire pit. It was little more than a circle of blackened stones, but the ash inside was a treasure trove. Forensic analysis of the ash revealed it contained charcoal from multiple different types of wood, all native to the surrounding forest. More importantly, the layering of the ash indicated it had been used repeatedly over a long period. This wasn't the site of a single campfire. It was a hearth, a place someone had returned to again and again for warmth and cooking. Near the fire pit, they found more, a scattering of tiny, brittle bones almost lost in the cave dust. An expert identified them as belonging to small animals, squirrels, rabbits, and even a few species of cave-dwelling birds. Alongside the bones, they found several sharpened sticks. They were crude tools, their points hardened in a fire, but their purpose was unmistakable. They were spears or skewers. Someone had been hunting, bringing their catch back to the cave and cooking it over the fire. The evidence painted a staggering picture of survival, a testament to human resilience that bordered on the unbelievable. The team began to piece together a new dominant theory, one grounded not in malice, but in a desperate fight for life. It likely began with the fall. Jasmine, perhaps disoriented or having taken a wrong turn in the dense woods, stumbled into the unseen fissure. The 60-foot drop would have been catastrophic, but her large, well-padded hiking pack could have acted as a crude airbag, cushioning her impact just enough to save her life. She would have been severely injured, broken bones, a concussion, internal trauma, but alive, trapped in the darkness at the bottom of the pit. In those initial hours or days, her training and will to survive would have taken over. The radio, her only link to the outside world, would have been her priority. Perhaps before she fell, or in a moment of adrenaline-fueled desperation afterward, she managed to throw it upwards, hoping it would land near the opening where its signal could be caught. Or maybe, in a feat of incredible strength, she managed to climb partway back up the fissure wall before her injuries overwhelmed her, wedging the device into the crevice as a final desperate act before falling back to the bottom. Trapped and in agony, she would have used her sleeping bag for warmth and subsisted on whatever food she had in her pack. Weeks, maybe even months, could have passed this way as her body slowly, painfully mended in the cold, absolute dark. Her flashlight would have been her most precious possession, its beam her only sun. It was during this period of recovery that she must have begun to explore, crawling or limping her way through the passages leading away from the pit, searching for another way out. And eventually, she found it. The discovery of the large walkout entrance must have felt like a miracle, a literal light at the end of the tunnel. She was no longer a prisoner. She could leave. This new theory explained the fire pit, the animal bones, the sharpened sticks. She had turned the cave from a tomb into a base of operations. She had learned to hunt, to make fire, to survive. She had become a part of the wilderness in a way she could never have imagined. But this theory, as compelling as it was, also created its own agonizing paradox. If she found the easy way out, why did she never retrieve the radio? The most logical answer was also the simplest. Her flashlight batteries died. Without a light source, navigating the complex, pitch-black maze of the cave to get back to the Pfizer would have been impossible, a suicidal risk. The radio, her last message in a bottle, was lost to her forever in the darkness. So, she walked out of the cave, leaving her old life behind at the bottom of the pit. She stepped back into the sunlight, a survivor, a ghost returned to the world of the living. But the story doesn't end there. It collides with a final, terrifying question. After surviving the fall, the injuries, and years of isolation, what happened to her next? She never called her brother. She never accessed her bank accounts. She never tried to reclaim her life. She simply walked out of one mystery and into another. The sinister undertone of the murdered hiker from 2019, the case that had briefly reopened her file, returned with chilling force. The investigators were now haunted by a new, even more tragic possibility. Had Jasmine Kensington performed a miracle of survival, enduring years of hardship to heal herself and win her freedom, only to walk out of that cave and into the path of a human predator? Had she survived the wilderness only to be consumed by the very world she was trying to rejoin? For 4 months, Detective Wallace and his team chased down phantom leads, recanvassing towns within a 50-mile radius of the cave, showing Jasmine's 6-year-old photograph to people who had no reason to remember a face they might have seen for a fleeting moment more than a year ago. The trail was as cold as it had ever been. It seemed the final chapter of Jasmine Kensington's story was destined to remain unwritten. The breakthrough, when it came, was not the result of police work but of pure random chance. In early February 2024, a local man named George Petrie was making his annual rounds to retrieve the memory cards from a series of trail cameras he maintained on a large tract of private woodland. He was a hunter, but he was also a naturalist, and his cameras were his way of keeping a silent watch on the movements of the deer, bear, and other wildlife that shared his land. One of his camera lines was particularly remote, set up along an old, overgrown logging path that was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. He rarely checked these cameras, sometimes letting a full year pass between visits. Back in his dusty workshop, he sat down with a cup of coffee to review the footage, a ritual he enjoyed. He clicked through thousands of images and short video clips, a doe and her fawn stepping delicately through the undergrowth, a black bear scratching its back on a tree, a raccoon staring into the lens with its bright masked eyes. It was mostly routine. He was about to swap out the card from the last camera when he paused on a clip from deep within the archive. The timestamp in the corner of the grainy infrared footage read August 14, 2022, 4:52 a.m. The clip was only 15 seconds long. It showed a figure walking down the center of the old logging path. It was not an animal. It was a person moving with a weary but steady and determined gait. The figure was gaunt, their clothes tattered and dark in the grayscale of the night vision footage. Their hair was long and matted, but as the person passed directly in front of the camera, they turned their heads slightly, as if reacting to the faint click of the infrared sensor activating. For a few clear frames, the camera captured their profile. The facial structure, the high cheekbones, the set of the jaw was unmistakable. Despite the hardship etched onto her features, it was Jasmine Kensington. George Petrie stared at the screen, his coffee forgotten. He had followed the news of the cave discovery months earlier. Everyone in the region had. He knew that face. He watched the clip again, and then a third time. The woman in the video was alive. She was on her feet, and she was walking with purpose. He immediately called the sheriff's department. Detective Wallace viewed the footage with a sense of profound awe and dread. It was the proof he had theorized but never truly expected to find. It confirmed everything. Jasmine had survived the cave. She had walked out. The date on the footage, August 2022, fit perfectly with the forensic timeline of the radio's battery life. This was the ghost captured on film. This was the end of her trail in the wilderness. The location of the trail camera provided the final crucial piece of the geographical puzzle. It was positioned on a path nearly 20 meters from the cave's easy exit. A 20-meter journey through dense woods for a person in her condition would have been an epic feat of endurance. More importantly, the old logging path, as Wallace discovered from maps, eventually intersected with a paved state highway just 5 miles further on from the camera's location. Jasmine had been walking toward civilization. She was 5 miles from a road where a single passing car could have been her salvation, but the trail ended there. A renewed, massive public appeal was launched, this time with a grainy, haunting image from the trail camera. Flyers were posted at truck stops and diners along that stretch of highway. Investigators interviewed every resident and business owner within a 10-mile radius, but no one remembered seeing her. No trucker recalled a lone woman walking on the shoulder of the road in the pre-dawn hours. No one reported picking up a hitchhiker. The trail camera footage was the last known proof of Jasmine Kensington's existence. The case remained suspended in an agony of possibilities. The most optimistic and least likely theory is that she was picked up and, for reasons of her own, chose to disappear into a new life, leaving her past behind. But investigators find that hard to believe. A woman who fought so hard to survive would not so easily abandon the brother she loved. The more prevalent and far darker theory is the one that has haunted the case from the beginning, that Jasmine Kensington survived the fall, endured the darkness, and walked 25 miles back to the world only to encounter the one predator more dangerous than any in the wild. Her story ends on the shoulder of a lonely highway, a final, terrible silence that the mountains can no longer be blamed for keeping.